very much. Yes. Okay. The reason I'm doing research on bats in late antiquity is that so far no such study has been done for Thrace. What I knew when I started working on the topic was that the ancient bats in Bulgaria disappeared in 4th century. This turned out to be not the case. Just a moment. I'm grateful for the opportunity to consult with people who have more in-depth research on bats and batting. Elena Nikolova, Nikolai Sharankov, and Maria Avramova. The two ladies will present their dissertations related to various batting cases in the near future. Cicero specifically used baunea for public baths and bauneum to denote private facilities. Pliny is the first who used therme. We are not entirely sure in which case therme is used and when bauneum. Then to claim that in late antiquity the therme disappeared, it's not entirely true. The main problem of these buildings is the high cost for construction and maintenance, usually depending on the private patronage. When there is no more money from private patronage, the structure is gone. So before I start, I want to say a few words that before more than around 110 years ago, the first ancient bat from Bulgaria was excavated from Professor Bogdan Fiuv. But until now, more than 100 years later, there is no full publication about it, which is one of the biggest problems of Bulgarian archaeology. On the other hand, during 1992, on the papers of Journal of Roman Archaeology, was the published Roman batting and bats and batting was from the first international conference on that topic. It's very interesting that 4 years later, 4 years later, in Varna, which is a city in Bulgaria, there was a second conference, but the paper was never been published. Sorry, there is some problems with my presentation. Sorry about that. Come on. Okay, sorry about that. So I want to present you a few problems which are connected with all of Bulgarian expeditions and excavations. Firstly, we have excavations. Later, we have primary publication. After that, we have more excavations, but that brings us to the one of the biggest problem in Bulgarian archaeology, lack of the complete publication. That is really serious, and it's very important subject when we talk about the batting in late antiquity. Later, it is important to say that the excavator, the scientist, had the copyrights, which brings us to the next problem, to impossibility to use the data from, let's just say, youngest researchers like me or somebody else. And naturally, without publications and after years, the research passed away. this leads us to another problem that lies. No, excuse me. We have more problems which are connected with looters. In Bulgaria, we have really big problems with that. In the near past, our archaeologists had the problems about the lack of access to foreign literature. Even more because the political statements, I don't know. There is a political influence in history and archaeology. One of the strange problems is that many scientists have made new survey of the rest of the architecture without being able to use the data from the stratigraphy. And later we have conservation and restoration. This leads us to another problem that lies perhaps not to the root of all other, the lack of working legislation. Those problems to lack of knowledge about the site. Later, new studies of new sites or old ones follow, and they do not have the opportunity to use the parallels from those already studied. So the wheel of trouble is complete. This Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, was the natural heir of the Roman Empire. By the end of the 4th century, there were 11 thermae in Rome and 8 in Constantinople. There were 856 balneum at Rome and 153 at Constantinople, around the beginning of 5th century. Ostia, Athens, and Timgat each had more than 1,000. By the 5th century, the church started to provide baths exclusively for the poor and for the clergy. At Rome, the term of Agrippa still functioned in the 5th century. The baths on the Aventine were restored in 414, and those in Constantinople in 443, while Theodoric restored the baths of Caracalla. Of the 8 term at Constantinople, listed in Notitia Orbis Constantinopolitanae, 4 were built, completed, or rebuilt in the 5th and 6th century. So, on this map, I'm showing you the baths which I found so far. As you can see, there is at least few layers. The blue ones, it's baths from cities and from castles. The red ones, it's from villa. The green ones, it's from natural baths around natural springs, and black spots, it's from cities without any knowing baths so far. And there is purple spots, but I'm talking about them later. So I will present you 3 topics related to baths without being able to exhaust the problem. In fact, I must point out that this has been in the focus of my research for about a year. I will certainly not be able to show you ready-made answers, but rather I will make some suggestions, and I will be happy for your opinions. So we are here. So the first topic is, I call it long baths. That's them. As like I already told you, the blue ones it's from cities. The red ones it's from villas. So I will start with Dorstorum, which is on the bank on Danube River, and here you can see the earlier legionary fortress, north of which it's canave of the fortress, and here you can see the latentic fortress. So here is the bat. It's identified as episcopal bat, and before some future reasons, I want to note you to look carefully when I show you some bats. To take a good look, is it possible to find some church around the bat? So the next example is from Nove. It's other legendary camp, which later become a latent town, which was excavated from Polish and Bulgarian teams. And what I'm showing you now is the bishopric of Nove, which possess bat. Okay, we continue with Escus. As you can see here, there is 4 bats, maybe even term, but they were never been published. Actually, I had even a problem to find this plan of the bat. Nevertheless, we have the identical plans like the other ones. You can also notice that there is some later structure which was added to one of the sides of the bat. And one more site, it's the view of ancient view of Madara. And this particularly bat, it's very interesting because it's according to researcher who excavated the site, the bat was built after the demolition of the ancient viewer, and it was dated around the end of the 5th century, the beginning of the 6th century. But later, Professor Ventsislav Dinchev redates the bat about the end of the 4th, the beginning of the 5th century. This is quite interesting and will be important for later. Okay, a few more examples from Kabyle this time. As you can see, here we have a terme of Kabyle, and not very far. It's far, but not very. There is a basilica, and this is the small bat. The only available information for this bat is we know that it's only from late antiquity, around 4th century, but that's all. And as you can see, it's right next to the ancient basilica number 1. Few more examples from Augusta Traiana, modern Stara Zagora. North of this ancient city, it's locates the Villa Suburbana, in which around the beginning of 5th century was at a bath. In this site, it's quite interesting that that building was converted into church, and later in this area, which was never been excavated so far, that part was interpreted as a church too. Okay, and one more, but with identical plan. And 2 more parallels around Serdica. Left, you can see the ancient view near Filipovci, which had a batting structure, and a site to modern neighborhood. I forgot it, never mind. But that structure was interpreted as martyrium, like this one. So as you can see, we have identical structures, but with different yeah, never mind. Okay, So as we can see, this is a diagram of the sites about their chronology. And as we can see, their chronology starts about the very end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 4th century, and continue to the second half of the 6th century. Okay, now as you can see, I will show you some parallels around the empire. Here is the parallels from Zenobia, Barat, and Bat E in Antiochia. And as you can see, it's the sites, they are with identical architecture like the one which I already showed you from Bulgaria. So when we compare these sites from Bulgaria, and most importantly about their chronology, until now I'm not very sure what can I tell you, because this site, which is Leptis Magna, the chronology of this site, it's base, it's the earliest chronological period. And after that, we can see that the bats from Bulgaria, from Thrace, it's the next. I don't know so far how to interpret this, but this is what the results show so far. So the next topic is about bats into churches, or converted into churches. And I'm again showing you the main map from Bulgaria. And this time I want to focus your view about the purple spots here and here. This is the only sites which I can show you so far about bats converted into churches. So I will repeat that the bats remained one of the popular institutions of late antiquity and of the early Byzantine city, despite the strong criticism of church fathers such as Saint Jerome and Saint Augustine, whose letters and texts were meant only for the special groups of Christians, ascetics, and virgins. Jerome wrote, "He who has once bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath." On the other hand, literary sources all over the empire from 4th to 7th century recount how the average Christian and even members of clergy used public baths. Even emperors such as Valens Theodosius and Justinian sponsored the construction and restoration of baths. However, there is change in late antiquity, consequence of changed perspective, which does not have to be necessarily connected with conflicts and catastrophes. Church tolerate bathing as a hygienic and medical activity in small balnea, not in large thermae, which are expensive to maintain and very luxury for the taste of church. Some baths were even owned by churches and monasteries. They even built baths in combination with baptistery, like some parallels in Rome, Ravenna, Quito, and Jerusalem. Good example from the Acts of St. John, who wrote in the 5th century, when he started to work in the public baths in Ephesus, which were haunted by the wicked demon, probably the spirit of goddess Artemis. He successfully cast the demons out. Another source is telling us about the term of declaration in Rome, which probably had been purified in a similar manner before part of it could be transformed into a monastery at the end of 11th century under the Pope Urban II. Uh, so I include additional topic for aqueducts of the territory. In a recent monography of the subject, its chronological scope it is from the 1st to the 4th century, and the fate of the aqueducts is not clear from the 4th century onwards. Here I'm showing you the parallel chronology about the aqueducts from the Western Mediterranean. And just to remind you that the longest known so far aqueduct is from Constantinople, and it's built some parts from 4th century, some from 5th century. Here I'm showing you the aqueduct of Serdica. It's really interesting, the place where he comes in the city. He comes from this direction to here and continue in this direction where there is at least one very big therme and two more baths. And later I'm gonna show you about this ancient catchment. Nevertheless, it's a really interesting fact that we have inscription that tells us about some restoration of the aqueduct of Serdica in 479, and I'm very thankful about to Nicolae Shrankov about help me with that source. Again, I'm showing you Augusta Triana and where was the ancient aqueduct. As you can see, he starts from here and comes to here and continue in this direction when it comes to this structure, which was interpreted as the great therme of the city. But by the way, before a few years, there is some consideration about that site. It's not exactly therme. There is opportunity to be a therme gymnasium, but without archaeological excavations in the north part of it, we could not tell that surely. So here they are, the only 3 parallels from Bulgaria about but converted into churches. We have really big troubles with that site because they were never been published properly. We have separate articles about them. We are not sure about their chronology, and by the way, we are not even sure about their architecture. As you can see, this is the original drawings of the architecture and the archaeologists. And as you can see, this part was interpreted that was destroyed about the time when the bath was erected. So what can parallels tell us? Here are some parallels from the empire. They're mostly from Turkey, and there is one from Greece so far. The parallels show that conversion starts from the beginning of the 5th century, from the about the sites which are out of which are not in Bulgaria. By the way, the chronology, the blue lines, which they are from the sites from Bulgaria. They are not sure. They're not secured. I mean, because, like I said a few times, they never been published so far. So this chronology show only hypothetical dates about the sites, but I prefer to show you that because it's really interesting that that even later dates, they are not we don't need to expel them because we need first to publish and later to interpret them. And the last topic is about cross-shaped baths, martyriums, and churches. Again, I'm showing you Serika, and this time I'm showing you a structure, a building, which was interpreted as a bath. But according to Professor Venceslav Dinchev, it's quite possible that structure to not be a bath, to be some private house or something like this. Again, I'm showing you Augustriana, and that church was at first time was a martyrium, and later, around the beginning of 5th century, was converted into church. So we have these two examples, and I would like to show you at least one more, which is located in Pliska. Pliska is very, let's just say, complicated site because of his ideological and political problems about the contemporary state Bulgaria. This site was interpreted as the first Bulgarian capital, and as such, our scientists doesn't find any ancient structures around Pliska. But it's really interesting that below the great basilica in Pliska, they found some cross-shaped, they call it like this, cross-shaped church. But strangely, they give it strange that about to 10th century, and this is really strange because the church above it, it's from 9th century. So here they are again, and when I continue to search for more parallels, I found a few more examples. One in Zikibeva. It was interpreted as martyrium again, right next to church. One more martyrium, which is around 5 kilometers west from Rațiaria, and this martyrium complex near to Volan. And some late antique churches, they are cross-shaped churches. I'm showing you again the main map, but this time I'm adding a new layer, this time with medieval baths. So as you can see, the general diagram of the chronology of baths from late antiquity and this time in early Middle Ages. As you can see, the main usability of baths is here in late antiquity. Probably it's better to repeat that the blue column sits from cities, the red one sits from villas, the green one sits from natural spring baths, the yellow one sits from Middle Ages cities. Yeah, but as you can see, there is some kind of hiatus here in the 7th century, despite the fact that there is at least one bath in 7th century in the city of Mesambria Pontica, and at least one mineral spring in Starozgorski Mineralni Bani. But like I already mentioned a few times, these sites never been published, so we are not absolutely sure about this chronology. Uh, the recent years, we have systematic research about the Western Mediterranean, and some of the parts of the Western Mediterranean was connected with the Byzantine Empire. And that allows us to compare the chronology from the baths from Bulgaria and the one from the Western Mediterranean. And as you can see, there is no big difference between them, except the fact that those from Western Mediterranean, their chronology is from regions. But we should see what the science will show us in the future. I pay your attention before a couple of minutes about the location of the baths and the churches. In this example, at Quikil in Algeria, as you can see, there is at the beginning of 5th century church, and not so far there is a bath like here, which is something which appear in that period. I need to say that I'm not pretty sure about that interpretation, but so far it's not. We can suggest that and think in this way in the future. One more example from Carthage in Tunisia. Yep. So here, out of the city, we have a bath, and in the 5th century there is a church there. That's continue later, and we have the same situation here in the forum. Here, right next to the forum, and so on. When the Seljuk Turks came from Anatolia, they found small public baths still existed and usable in Constantinople during the 12th and 13th century. The culture of bathing in the classic world was inherited by Byzantium and the Arabic and Turkish society of the East, which kept the tradition alive, but in the West it comes to the end by the 7th century. And as you can see, there is medieval bath from around the second half of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century in Thessaloniki. There is few manuscripts which showing bathing behavior of the Western Mediterranean society. They're quite interesting. Yeah, and here, before a couple of days, I think that my presentation should have ended here. But I was enforced to include a few more slides. So I will read that because it's really strange and awkward for me. It seems that to a large extent, this Christianity is the reason why, at least on the Balkans, both under the influence of the already established Christian norms of life, and as a reaction against the behavior of the new conquerors, the Ottoman Turks, who as Muslims had the code of the water, the locals neglected natural hygiene needs. From 18th century, the wife of the British consul in Istanbul was Lady Mary Montagu, who write letters about her spending time in the Ottomanian capital, and she traveled all around the states, and she even visits Sofia, and her letters was inspiring Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres to paint his famous Turkish bath. From 1878, Bulgaria became an independent state, and Sofia was her capital. Saint George, which is the church I already showed you about, one of the parallels of baths converted into churches. During the Ottomanian period, was converted into Yukami, and we know that the locals go there, go next to the mosque. Because there was a well from which water was drawn for health, which is quite interesting for me. And like I tell you that about this ancient water catchment. This catchment was the catchment of one of the latent baths in Serdica, but that bath was never been fully excavated. But nevertheless, the position of that catchment and that bath is quite interesting, because later around the mosque there is few baths. By the way, Evliya Çelebi visited the city in the 17th century, and he tells us that there is at least 5 contemporary baths in Sofia. And it's quite interesting that later, at the beginning of 20th century, here was built a contemporary bath here at the same place. Before to finish, I want to tell that generally you don't need a bath to go bathing, especially if you have a mineral spring as this one in Sofia. And I want to tell you something which Nicolae Shrankov drew my attention. It's about that in the contemporary Bulgarian language there is something which we tell that it's a happy bath, which it seems that it's ancient heritage, which is quite interesting for me. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I hope if you have some questions and consideration. Yeah, thank you. That's it. So if you have questions, please.